Hi, ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place where the walls are thick with prayer and the beds are slightly too uncomfortable to be sinful. Welcome to the sleepy corridors of an 18th century convent, where life was orderly, devout, and ever so slightly drafty. Before we curl up in the warmth of our imagination, go ahead and press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. There. Much better. Now, close your eyes, or keep them half-lidded if you're multitasking sleep, and let's peek inside a convent in the early 1700s, just before dawn, when the world is still, and the dreams are just starting to fade into whispers. The convent bell, large and dignified, rings gently through the morning mist, sounding more like a suggestion than a command. It's not exactly an alarm clock, it's more like a Gregorian nudge. The sisters, wrapped in rough woolen habits, begin to stir. In these early hours, there are no groans or protests, just the soft rustle of linen, the creak of well-worn wood, and the occasional whispered sigh, because even the most devout sometimes dream of 5 more minutes. Most convents followed the rule of St. Benedict, which, among other things, determined when you woke, when you prayed, and, importantly, when you were allowed to talk at all. Spoiler alert, not often. Silence was prized not just for the soul's sake, but because it greatly reduced the risk of early morning gossip, which even the Lord would find tedious before breakfast. The daily schedule began with matins, the night prayer, followed shortly by lauds, because nothing says rise and shine like long Latin psalms under candlelight. For the nuns, these early vigils weren't seen as chores, but as sacred rhythms, a way to align the heart with the stars and the stomach with breakfast, although breakfast wouldn't come for a while. First, it was God. Oats came second. The convent was a quiet hive, its members ranging in age from unsure young novices to serene, perpetually unimpressed elders who had long since accepted that the cloistered life meant fewer earthly distractions and significantly more soup. Speaking of soup, it was usually there, waiting quietly in some form or other, despite it being 6 in the morning. Meals were humble, bread, maybe cheese, and if the abbess was feeling particularly cosmopolitan, a boiled egg. Meat was rare and celebrated with a joy just shy of sinful. You might imagine a grey stone building under an overcast sky, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But inside the convent, life glowed in its own way. Through discipline, belief, and community, a warmth emerged. And in the chilly kitchen, Sister Caterina, with a wimple always slightly askew, could be found muttering gentle prayers and judgment over the state of the root vegetables. Morning tasks followed prayers. These varied depending on the region and wealth of the convent. Some sisters maintained herb gardens, others copied texts by hand, and the especially lucky ones got to feed the convent cats, also known as the holiest of freeloaders. In wealthier convents, where dowries had brought in generous donations, nuns studied music, painted illuminated manuscripts, or even, in rare and glorious cases, brewed wine. In less fortunate convents, the day might involve laundering habits with homemade lye soap and pretending not to notice when Sister Agnes, accidentally, wore the softest one for the 4th time that week. But perhaps one of the greatest comforts of convent life was its predictability. Every day had its rhythm, its cadence. Time moved in chimes and chants. For women who'd entered willingly, many did, believe it or not, it was a life of purpose. For others, sent there by families with too many daughters and not enough inheritances, it was, well, also a life of purpose, albeit peppered with the occasional passive-aggressive embroidery. One might think silence and prayer would add up to boredom, but in truth, the sisters found subtle rebellion in the most charming of ways. Illicit letters composed in Latin puns, hidden sweetmeats, a goose named Clementina that wasn't strictly allowed, but whom everyone fed behind the refectory. As the sun finally climbed above the chapel spire and melted the morning fog, the convent settled into its daytime hush. The sisters moved through stone hallways with soft footsteps, their voices quiet, but their inner worlds humming with psalm and purpose. And just beyond the cloister garden wall, a new sound begins to rise. Not a bell, but the rustle of parchment, ink freshly ground, a novice with mischief in her eyes and a forbidden quill in her hands. But that is a whisper for another night. Chapter 2. Silent Mornings and the Whisper of Bells. If you've ever woken before dawn to the sound of a cat sneezing in the distance, or a milk truck that thinks it's a musical instrument, you may be close to understanding the early mornings in an 18th century convent. Except, instead of milk trucks, we have bells. So many bells. Big bells, small bells, bells that peal politely, and bells that sound positively judgmental if you're 3 minutes late to chapel. Convent mornings began before the sun could even consider clocking in. Around 4 a.m., the bell tower would ring out its musical summons, gently, or not so gently, nudging every nun from her dreams of divine choirs, fields of lavender, or perfectly kept ledgers. This bell, known as the Matins bell, was both a spiritual alarm clock and a firm reminder that heaven, unlike your feather-stuffed mattress, waits for no one. Rising in the dark wasn't just an exercise in spiritual discipline, it was practically a contact sport. Picture a line of sleepy women in worn woolen habits, weaving their way through cold stone corridors, careful not to trip over their own slippers. Silence was already in effect. Yes, even at that hour, because if one thing was more revered than the clergy in an 18th century convent, it was quietness. Most convents followed the rule of St. Benedict or some variation thereon, which can be loosely translated as, when in doubt, hush. Speech was limited to what was necessary, and the rest was left to nods, glances, or, if you were feeling bold, the universal language of exasperated sighs. Communication was an art of eyebrows. After matins, the first hours of prayer in a cycle called the Divine Office, the nuns would return to their cells. Now, don't let the word cell throw you off. This isn't a prison story, though the drafty stone walls and lack of privacy might disagree. A nun's cell was a small, ascetic room with just enough space for a cot, a crucifix, a prayer book, and an impressive collection of quiet. Contrary to what you may imagine, not all convents were bundles of gloom. There were little comforts, little rituals. One nun might tuck dried lavender among her linens. Another might carve tiny crosses into the wooden ledge of her window. One for each answered prayer, or unanswered, depending on the sincerity of the carving. Breakfast was taken in the refectory, but calling it breakfast may be slightly generous. Picture a crust of very determined bread, dipped into a cup of hot water that had, at one point, passed by a potato and briefly nodded in its direction. Occasionally, there'd be porridge, a consistency somewhere between oatmeal and grout, and everything, again, in silence, except for a single reader, who would read aloud from a holy text so the others could, while chewing stoically, feed both body and soul. The diet, while humble, was deeply tied to the idea of discipline. Many believed that resisting rich foods helped focus the mind on spiritual matters. Though admittedly, that does raise the question, was God more present in cabbage soup than in custard? The theological jury is still out on that one. Daylight gradually slipped through the narrow windows, casting long beams onto sanded stone floors. And as the convent began to glow with a hush of gold, work began. Each woman had her tasks. Some tended to the garden, coaxing reluctant herbs from the reluctant soil. Others worked the laundry, which involved a mystifying number of starches and buckets of suspiciously cold water. A few would illuminate manuscripts, painting delicate golden angels whose faces bore suspicious resemblance to Sister Margaret. But above it all, above the chores, the chill, the faint scent of boiled turnip, there was a serenity to the routine, a rhythm. For some, these walls offered protection, purpose, and a quiet dignity not often afforded to women beyond them. To leave behind the unpredictable turbulence of marriage markets, dowry negotiations and accidental cousin courting was no small thing. And within that quiet life, many women found a form of agency. They managed estates, taught girls, composed music, even brewed herbal remedies that would later be poached by physicians with slightly too much confidence and not enough lavender. As the sun climbed higher, the convent stirred into its full day's motion, a strange, peaceful choreography of prayer and purpose. And so, with the scent of morning herbs trailing from the kitchen and the cloisters awash in drowsy sunlight, we pause our tale just as the sisters lift their eyes to the morning sky, ready for whatever humble miracles the day might offer. Next, we'll wander a little deeper into convent life and meet a group of particularly industrious women with ink-stained fingers and tabletops full of secrets. Chapter 3. The Sound of Habits and Hushed Footsteps. If you were to step inside the thick stone walls of an 18th-century convent, quiet now, with time muffling every echo like a pillow over history's face, you might be surprised to find not chilly silence, but the low, rhythmic hum of daily life. The convent may have been called a cloister, but it was never truly silent, just very gently turned down. Each day began not with a sunrise, but with a bell. Not the cheery ding of a town square niece's wedding, mind you, but a sonorous bronze toll that sounded exactly like duty felt. Long, heavy, punctual. That first clang, they called it matins, was an invitation to prayer, and by invitation, we mean obligation. All the sisters, swaddled in wool habits and half wrapped in what could only be described as God's version of a comforter, would rise from their wooden pallet beds with the exasperated reverence of people who had not yet invented coffee. The stone floors were cold enough to make even the most surrendered soul reconsider her devotion for one fleeting moment. But the footsteps, oh, the footsteps, scuffed leather soles, thick knitted stockings, slippers that had loosened through the decades like old secrets. They whispered across the stone in a slow shuffle. It was like a chorus of apologetic ghosts, if the ghosts were a bit nearsighted and half asleep. And then came the habits. Yes, habit was both what the sisters wore and, some might argue, what they became. Think of them as long, voluminous robes, dyed to the exact colour of pious moderation, somewhere between soot and oatmeal, with a hint of sky on a rainy day if you squinted. They were modest, of course, but also impressively aerodynamic. Nuns had to learn the unique skill of turning corners without tripping over a hem, an act that required agility, foresight, and grace. Or, failing that, deeply ingrained patience. It's worth noting that clothes were not simply clothes in the convent. They were small sermons stitched into fabric, Veils layered over wimples, which were not a 17th century dance, despite sounding like one, created a frame around each sister's face, like parentheses around a holy thought. Interestingly, these garments also had an unmistakable sound. The rustle of linen, the swish of wool, the occasional umph, as someone tried to fasten a belt over too much porridge. These became the background music of everyday convent life. Sacred ruffles, muffled steps. It was as if the very air had been trained to tread lightly. Keep in mind, laundry was no small feat. Convent rules dictated cleanliness, but the 18th century was not exactly brimming with washing machines. So every now and then, the convent yard would be transformed into a vision of holy fluttering. Grey and white habits billowed in the breeze like mild apparitions. And of course, because nuns loved order almost as much as they loved God, those robes would be hung in precise alphabetical sequence, if, that is, habits had names. In between prayers and chores, a rhythm more reliable than the moon's phases, the sisters moved through their days guided by centuries of repetition. There was peace in the pattern, the same hallways, the same bell tones, the same quiet rustle as Sister Gertrude, who hadn't run in 20 years, briskly chased a goose out of the vegetable patch again. But hush, don't let that mischief disturb your calm. It was all part of the sacred routine. Chaos visited, yes, but only in the gentlest of forms. A misplaced hymn book, a toppled candle, an argument over whether St. Margaret's feast day allowed for extra butter. These were not dramatic lives, but they were deeply lived, within the rhythm of rustling cloth and candlelight. If ever there was excitement, it came in the form of thread colour. A scandal once occurred when a long-forgotten embroidery box revealed bluish-grey wool instead of regulation charcoal. You would not believe the embroidery tension that ensued. It lasted 3 months and sparked a small, polite schism in the sewing room. But this was life in the habit. Quiet, patterned, clothed in devotion and drafty corridors. It was not loud, but neither was it empty. Now, as the veiled footsteps soften and the habits are folded neatly into a drawer of memory, let us drift forward to the pulse of the convent itself, a place where time stood still, and the real power was not in politics, but in parchment. Chapter 4. The Sound of Silence and Bells. If you're trying to fall asleep, dear listener, there is no better soundtrack than the muted hush of an 18th century convent, a place so quiet, even a dust mote landing too confidently might feel like it's making a scene. But make no mistake, this wasn't silence from idleness or boredom. This was purposeful, reverent stillness, the kind of quiet that wears sensible shoes and knows when to keep a secret. Let's drift now, gently, into the rhythms of the day inside the convent walls. You see, in the outside world of bartering bakers and thundering horses, time was a little wobbly. But in the convent, time was sacred, measured, and struck quite regularly by bells, big bells, little bells, bells that tolled for prayers, bells that urged washing hands, bells that implied quite firmly that your peas were getting cold. These weren't just dainty dings either. These were robust, purpose-driven clanks. If you've never been sternly summoned to matins by a church bell, you haven't been truly woken up. The first bell, often well before dawn, would call the nuns to their morning prayers, known as vigils. Picture women wrapped in woolen habits, gliding under stars not yet ready to yawn. Bleary-eyed but devout, with candlelight flickering on pale stone walls, they would sing psalms in Latin, some perfectly in tune, some not, but all equally sincere. Their singing, by the way, wasn't for a congregation. It was more like a private concert for the divine, though some historians suspect that Sister Agnes in the alto section was just a bit too proud of her vibrato. The days were divided by more than the sun. They were sectioned with prayer times, known as the Divine Office. Not office as in typewriters and pretentious coffee orders. No, this was holier and frankly less stressful. The Divine Office consisted of 8 services, evenly carved out over 24 hours. It gave the day a structure that was oddly reassuring, like quilted time, something soft you could wrap your soul in. Though modern sleep schedules might balk at all the 2 a.m. prayers, the rhythm became second nature within the convent. The silence between services was intended for reflection, though sometimes, perhaps, for brief, cheeky naps behind library curtains. We won't point fingers. Silence was also a virtue, literally. Called the Great Silence, it began after Compline, the last prayer of the day, and lasted until prime, the morning prayer. No chatter, no idle murmurs, not even a whispered, "Did you see Mother Superior's new stitching pattern?" Just hush. This commitment to quiet was both reverent and deeply practical. An 18th century solution to modern noise pollution, if you will. In a world without phones or TikToks, the mind had space to wander. And wander it did, gently, often toward the divine, but occasionally toward breakfast. Or Brother Thomas, the monk from the neighboring monastery, who had suspiciously good hair for someone with a vow of poverty. The quiet also allowed for deep focus during the day's manual labors. Nuns weren't just praying. They were baking, brewing, copying manuscripts, making herbal tinctures, and embroidering bishops' underpants with truly unnecessary levels of artistry. All of this was composed in near-perfect silence, broken only by the occasional cluck from the hen house or the gentle scraping of a quill. Communication wasn't entirely forbidden during silent hours. It was merely stylized. Convents often developed full sign languages for essential phrases like "pass the butter" or "you've taken the wrong psalter again." Some of these signs became quite refined, even elegant. It's said that one abbess could essentially deliver a sermon using only hand gestures and one expressive eyebrow. So what did this constant pause, the quiet, the prayer, the bells, do to a person? Well, over time, it transformed the heart's rhythm. Thoughts became less frantic, more melodic. The mind learned to savor things, like the slow drip of candle wax or the rustle of a turning page. And in that stillness, amid the echo of footsteps and the faint ring of distant bells, a kind of inner music took root. Not everyone was meant for this life, of course. Some novitiates fidgeted their way right back out. But for those who stayed, the silence was more than an absence of noise. It was a daily brushing away of clutter from the soul. With that, the bell chimed softly in the distance once more, reminding us that it is time to wander next into the hush of everyday work within the convent, because even quiet hands have busy fingers. Chapter 5. Linen, Habits, and the Sacred Art of Laundry. While the world outside bustled with the thunder of carts and the rustle of powdered wigs, inside the high, cool walls of the convent, life moved to a more rhythmically folded pace. Today, we dream our way into a day of domestic grace, the sacred sudsy ritual of laundry. You may not associate nuns with laundry, dear listener. You may imagine them illuminated by candlelight, serenely copying sacred text, surrounded by Latin prayers and the scent of beeswax. And yes, sometimes. But linens do not wash themselves, and a habit can only look holy for so long before it begins to smell distinctly. Unholy. In the 18th century convent, laundry day was less a day and more an epic tale told in soap and steam, as involved and revered as any scripture. It often fell on Monday, a humble beginning to the week, cleansing both garments and symbolically souls. The day began early, not as early as matins, but certainly before any rooster had respectfully cleared his throat. Out through the cloistered halls marched the procession of linens, layers of white, stiff and starched, like ghosts waiting to be forgiven. There were wimples and veils, tunics and underclothes, sheets from the infirmary, towels from the sacristy, and the occasional mysterious cloth of unknown purpose. I like to think Sister Severina used it for drying freshly washed saint relics. At the heart of the courtyard, a low stone basin awaited, the convent lavatorium. Here, water was poured from heavy buckets, hauled in from the well with a teamwork that would put any modern rowing team to shame. Soap was made from years-old recipes, a blend of wood ash, lye, lard, and divinely stubborn optimism. It smelled of forgiveness and faintly of mutton. The habits, those flowing robes we picture so serenely, were heavy and woolen, cut to be modest, durable, and, shall we say, prayerfully insulating in both winter and the occasional existential crisis. Washing one was a challenge akin to laundering a small tent, yet launder they did, scrubbing diligently with coarse brushes while chanting verses, the suds frothing like clouds of repentance. You might imagine giggling was forbidden during laundry, but here's a little secret. Laundry day was a time when even the most solemn sisters allowed themselves a bit of whispered cheer, a splash here, a wink, and a shared joke there. Sister Magdalene was notoriously gifted at mimicking the Mother Superior's imperious tone, using only a slightly indignant turn of the washboard. It was considered hilarious by all but one. After scrubbing, the garments were rinsed in as many as 3 buckets of increasingly clear water, a laborious task performed with military precision and a faint smell of rosemary, added to the rinse water for freshness and possibly moral uplift. Then came wringing. 2 sisters would grip opposite ends of a dripping habit and twist with all the gusto of saints wringing out heresy. Once freed of its burdens, the garment was hung across cords strung in the garden, where it fluttered like a row of penitent clouds. The sun did its part, graciously drying habits while beaming cheerily across the cloister stone. The nuns, meanwhile, had their hands full with ironing, or rather, smoothing. The convent's irons were bricks heated by the hearth, wrapped in linen, and firmly, if politely, pressed over the garments. It was more gesture than precision, but in a quiet way, it was reverent. Even a wrinkle spoke in its own crumpled voice of devotion. Laundry in the convent wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a meditation, a form of service, a reminder that even the purest soul might find itself a bit spotted now and then. It also bonded the sisters in rhythm, in song, and occasionally in soap fights that no one officially admitted to. At day's end, the garments were collected, folded with reverence, and gently laid back into their cupboards, laundered and luminous, like small blessings tucked away for the next humble use. The convent would quiet again, the stone courtyard now empty, save for a single bucket left by accident or perhaps purposely. For what is a nun if not prepared for another wash? And as the sun dipped behind the convent wall, its light catching on the last twirl of drying linen, the sisters walked together toward the refectory, the smell of bread baking promising a reward after the holy domestic war with wool. And while wimples dried and habits hung quietly in line, something else was stirring behind the kitchen doors. Tomorrow, the sisters would tackle a new frontier, one involving broth, suspicion, and potatoes. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Cloister Garden. If you had wandered barefoot into the inner cloister garden of an 18th century convent, first of all, good for you. That's an excellent start to a dream. The grass is cool underfoot. The scent of lavender and rosemary wafts lazily through the air, and something about the stone walls makes even your thoughts whisper. The cloister garden was the green heart of any convent worth its salt, or for that matter, its saltwort. Carefully tucked inside 4 high walls, it was neither wild nor merely decorative. No, it was shaped with quiet intention, tended like a prayer with petals. Convent gardens weren't just for walking dreamy circles and quoting psalms into the wind, though that certainly happened, and with considerable flair. These were spaces of purpose, and yes, occasionally peas. Along the outer edges, one might find a grid of useful herbs: sage for health, basil to flavour the soup, fennel because even sisters need a little digestive aid, and rue, allegedly for spiritual purification, but suspiciously also known to repel fleas. A heavenly coincidence, perhaps. Many nuns, especially in larger and wealthier convents, pursued something approaching an amateur degree in herbology, medicine, and something remarkably close to botany. The convent garden was, in truth, half sanctuary and half pharmacy, with just a pinch of salad. You might spot Sister Beatrice there, a sprightly figure in her late 40s, though she insists she's been 45 since the Jacobite rebellion. Watch her crouch among the thyme and chamomile, muttering to herself in Latin, possibly praying, or cursing the snails with ecclesiastical gusto. It's hard to tell. You see, the cloister garden was the one place where a nun could be alone without being alone. Birds made soft scandal of their love songs overhead. Bees, the quietest and most productive of God's creatures, went about their work with a monkish kind of humility. And occasionally, though we shan't say this too loudly, a convent cat would saunter in, ignoring canon law and supervising the compost pile with inscrutable authority. One mustn't forget the symbolism stitched into each leaf and stone. Every part of the garden spoke a quiet Catholic language. The 4 paths crossing at the centre symbolized the 4 Gospels. The lush greenery reminded sisters of Eden, untouched. And the central fountain, if the convent had such a luxury, was a nod to the purifying waters of baptism. Plus, a well-placed fountain always helps mask the less poetic aroma of manure. Though life in convent walls often followed the rule of silence, laughter tended to bloom among the rosemary. Sister Agnes, for example, was notorious for impersonating the abbess using a topiary made from hedgerow clippings. She claimed it was satire in service of humility, and swore the topiary had received a full confession. Apples were often forbidden in convent gardens, as they were considered both worldly and spiritually ambiguous. Still, the occasional pear tree sprouted accidentally, often with suspicious symmetry and pruned branches. Nature has a funny way of following ecclesiastical symmetry when gently encouraged with a trowel. It wasn't all heavenly metaphors and chamomile tea, however. The gardens bore the brunt of seasonal change, just like any other patch of earth. Come winter, the frost crept over everything like a slow white sermon. And when storms swept across the land like tantrums thrown by underqualified saints, the sisters would rush to save the calendula as fervently as they would rescue the chapel hymnals. Sometimes, a visiting bishop might comment on the quaintness of the garden, its simplicity, its spiritual solitude. The nuns would nod politely while exchanging glances, silently foregoing the chance to mention the 3 separate toad outbreaks and one particularly aggressive goose that had taken up brief lodgings under the juniper bush. But hidden among marjoram and metaphor was something precious, an unspoken sense of ownership. A world carved by women's hands, quiet hands, calloused by the rosary and soil alike. The garden wasn't theirs by property, but by presence. No law of man or monk had written it into their names, but oh, they had written themselves into its roots. And as the dusk fell, a hush would settle deeper into the garden paths. Shadows stretched like yawns across the gravel. Lamps were lit one by one, and in that honeyed quiet between vespers and compline, you might hear the softest hymn drifting through the air, half floating, half forgotten. Somewhere beyond the hedges and herbs sat the convent's workshop, an unassuming place where candles were made, cloth was embroidered, and something surprising gleamed on the shelves. But that, dear listener, is a tale we shall take up in the soft violet light of tomorrow's dreaming. Chapter 7. The bells, and the sleepy schedule. They kept. Life inside an 18th century convent was not all incense and angelic contemplation, though there was surely plenty of both, and probably in reverse order. No, what really framed the days, guided the habits, and nudged the nuns from rest to reverence and back again, was perhaps the most persistent member of the community, the convent bells. Ah, those bells. At times gentle as a mother tapping on your shoulder with a sigh, at other times blaring with the enthusiasm of a rooster trained in opera. Installed high up in the bell tower, these cast-iron timekeepers rang out the shape of the day. And in a time long before smartphones and snooze buttons, their chimes were a steady anchor in a sea of spiritual timing. The first bell, matins, tugged the sisters from their straw-stuffed mattresses well before the sun dared peek over the horizon. Imagine being roused around 2 or 3 a.m. in a stone-walled dormitory, smelling faintly of beeswax, musty gowns, and dried lavender tucked under pillows as makeshift moth repellent. Wrapped in their sleep-wrinkled habits, the nuns quietly padded down drafty corridors by candlelight for the earliest prayers of the day. It was not a schedule designed by sleep enthusiasts, but rather than complain, the sisters leaned into the rhythm. Sleep was something you enjoyed in small spoonfuls throughout the day, like sugar hidden in tea, though, mind you, actual sugar was a luxury to be had under the watchful eye of a particularly generous abbess, or perhaps only on feast days. After matins, if they were lucky, the nuns might retreat for a short stretch of rest before the next bell beckoned them for lauds, the morning praises, usually just before dawn. This was followed in a swift celestial choreography by prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, each segment of the divine office like a sacred mile marker in the marathon of a nun's day. Some clever sister, somewhere, probably came up with a song to remember it all. Perhaps something catchy like, "Matins start before your dreams are through, then lauds and prime, and breakfast too. Terce by candle, sex by sun, none before your work is done." You get the idea. A convent hit, surely, hummed under breath between readings of Latin psalms. Of course, the bells weren't only about devotion. They were also a timetable for daily life. Meals, chores, study, silence, even designated sewing hours had their place on the invisible scroll unrolled by each peal. And should you wonder, dear listener, what happened if a bell was missed? Say, if Sister Honoria slept a bit too deeply after midnight prayers, well, God might forgive. But the abbess often required a little written confession and perhaps a week's duty of weeding the herb garden by hand. Lavender, rosemary, and repentance. nature's holy trinity. There were also feast days when the usual rhythm was dressed up a little. The bells might ring in a celebration, say, the Feast of St. Clare, or one of the Virgin's many devotions, and the schedule would adapt. More praying, yes, but also more singing, longer meals, extra bread, and in some convents, even sweetened wine. Such days were cherished like stars in the muted constellation of convent life, rare, twinkling, and usually followed by more hours of kneeling. But while the bells seemed relentless, there was great serenity in their familiar music. Imagine it now, soft tolls echoing down limestone halls, mingling with birdsong and quiet footsteps. It was a kind of order that cradled the day, comforting in its exactness. One didn't have to wonder what came next. The bells told you, firmly, lovingly, and perhaps a little too early. Sleep itself became a devotional act. Waking and resting were woven into worship, and even drowsiness during nocturnal prayers was treated with gentle understanding. After all, the spirit is willing, but the eyelids are heavy. And so, under the gaze of candlelit saints and beneath ceilings dusted with centuries of incense smoke, convent life moved quietly forward. Day after day, bell after bell, predictable, peaceful, and ever so slightly sleepy. Now, rest your thoughts and let time slow, as next we drift from the bell tower to the warmth of the convent kitchen, a place where prayers met porridge and the sacred stirred with the spoon. Chapter 8. The Sacred Choreography of Washing, Day. Now let us tiptoe, softly and squeaky-shoed, into the soundless thunder of an 18th century convent's most celebrated practical ritual. Washing Day. Yes, Washing Day. The event, wonderfully unexciting in name but surprisingly ceremonial in spirit, had a life of its own within the high stone walls of the cloister. And while the outside world may have thundered with revolutions and enlightenment, inside the convent, the most revolutionary thing to happen might be that Sister Marguerite managed to remove a particularly aggressive ink blob from her habit sleeve with a poultice of egg yolk, grated soap, and goose blessings. Now, as you might imagine, a convent full of women, working, praying, writing, gardening, and occasionally collapsing in giggles over the latest scandal in the Psalms, accumulated a fair bit of laundry. This included floor-length habits, layers of linen undergarments, stiff wimples, and occasionally a surprisingly high number of aprons, not to mention altar cloths, curtains, hankies, and the enigmatic liturgical doilies, the purpose of which remains murky, even to historians. Possibly placeholders, possibly weaponized embroidery. Regardless, the convent's washing day required precision, unity, and strong arms, or at least moderately dependable elbows. The day would begin just after matins, while the sky still wore its nightgown. With buckets and copper pans, the sisters would shuffle down, cloaked in faded cloaks and sleepy expressions, to the washhouse. Here, large stone tubs lined the walls like ancient bathtubs, which they rather were. Fireplaces bubbled water into a reluctant simmer, while grey soap floated nearby in hardened hunks, the size and general appearance of sleepy hedgehogs. The eldest among the sisters often supervised the mixing of the soap water, armed with centuries of washing wisdom and a healthy skepticism of shortcuts. "Don't stir counterclockwise," Sister Agatha would murmur. "That's how Brother Bernard lost his socks to the devil." Whether this was metaphorical or about actual sock loss is, tragically, unrecorded. Washing was not just about cleanliness. It was devotional, a union of humility and elbow grease. With hands in the water, sisters whispered quiet prayers, often for forgiveness, sometimes for patience, and occasionally because the lie had found a paper cut. One might think that spiritual reflection would be hard in a room full of splashing and ringing and slightly aggressive rinsing. But truth be told, those simple rhythms held a music of their own. There's a kind of lull in repetition, even when your life smells faintly of boiled linen and lavender mildew. It was not all drudgery, far from it. Washing day had a curious way of loosening tongues along with dirt. Jokes rippled through the air like steam. Quiet chuckles echoed between sudsy splashes. On particularly rebellious afternoons, anonymous laughter would burst from behind a soap sheet wall when someone, never named but frequently blamed, would pin a decorative lace ruffle onto the hem of Sister Anne's otherwise blameless habit. She left it on all day. The drying yards were long and windy, great lines of twine strung between wooden poles like clothesline harpstrings. Items hung in a peculiar order, reflecting either a mysterious devotional hierarchy or a very old laundry rota nobody dared question. Underthings were always pinned at the far end, both for modesty and a superstition involving wind spirits and small clothes drifting mysteriously into the bishop's garden. And of course, rain could ambush any chore. There was a particularly detested corner of the year, known only as the dripping fortnight, when sopping linens were hung indoors on rails above the kitchen, giving meals a fragrant undertone best described as holy stew with a hint of damp sermon. As the day faded and the laundry lines emptied, the convent settled into a slightly quieter peace. The wet garments now fluttered and hardened on hooks, while the sisters' arms tingled from wringing. It was a peculiar kind of tired, sacred, rhythmic, and pleasantly soapy. Washing day reminded the sisters, more than anything else, that the divine could be found in the ordinary, even in scrubbing a sock, or what passed for one in the 18th century, which was, if we're honest, more a boot-hugging enthusiasm of yarn than anything foot-shaped. And so the sun drifted below the cloister walls, folding itself into velvet shadows. Somewhere near the chapel, the last habit was laid to dry, and Sister Juliet was quietly congratulating herself for not accidentally washing her rosary again. Tomorrow would rustle in with quieter duties, and perhaps, if we listen gently, we can hear them preparing for something rather unexpected in the herb garden. Chapter 9. Needle, Thread, and a Whole Lot of Habits. The convent, quiet as a lullaby and composed like a hymn, had a hum to it, not quite the kind that buzzes, but the kind that sighs. Somewhere between the drip of holy water and the clink of copper kettles, there existed a sacred rhythm, and sewing, dear listener, was right at the heart of it. Today, we slip into the workroom, where the nuns spent their daylight hours seated side by side, rhythmically stitching their way through time. The air was dry with the scent of parchment and linen, and occasionally warm beeswax when candle making crept in as a side plot. But mostly, this was the dominion of cloth and patience, needlework, plain and holy. You see, an 18th century convent was not merely a spiritual haven, it was a miniature economy, and much of that economy was built stitch by careful stitch. Nuns were not permitted idleness. God, after all, noticed everything, and thus they embroidered, darned, patched, hemmed, and wove until calluses sanctified their thumbs. But this was no industrial frenzy. It was more of a textile meditation. 1 thread for Mary, 2 for Martha, 3 for the Holy Ghost. They made robes, vestments, altar cloths, delicate linen caps for bishops who preferred the austerity of white to the flashiness of velvet. Some convents even became renowned for their embroidery. Tiny silk stitches that spelled out Bible verses in Latin, or gloriously understated goldwork halos sewn into banners for feast days. Let us pause here and appreciate just how long it takes to hand embroider a halo. Quite long, especially when said halo must be approved by the Mother Superior, who may argue, gently of course, that it lacks sufficient celestial symmetry. Sewing in these convents existed upon a spectrum of solemnity. For less experienced novices, the eternal road began with the dreaded sock-mending drawer. Mountainous, mythically endless, and always full by Wednesday. Socks, mind you, that belonged to no man, rather to their fellow sisters, each assigned a number carefully embroidered into the cuff. And if you thought mismatched laundry was a modern problem, you've never seen Sister Agnes in tears over sock number 6 gone walkabout. The real artistry, however, was reserved for choir habits and feast day garments, billowing robes that swished with gravity and grace, each fold stitched to careful conformity. A habit was more than clothing. It was a uniform of humility, though some still managed flair, a secret tuck here, an almost visible cross-stitch of a lily there. Nothing showy, just subtle faith, sewn in silence. Silence, yes. The sewing rooms were hushed, save for the occasional whisper of redirected fabric or the pensive sigh of someone rethreading a finicky needle. Conversation was limited during the work period, but humour found a way, as it always does, when humans spend 6 consecutive hours wrestling satin. One nun, who went by Sister Apollonia but secretly preferred Polly, was infamous for sewing jokes into hems. Not literal jokes, mind you, but little hidden quirks, a stitch shaped like a fish, or a tiny initial where it wasn't supposed to be. Sister Magdalena once discovered a smiling sun sewn into the lining of her winter cloak. She never found out who did it, but she never turned in that cloak for repairs again either. Now, thread wasn't just thread. It was currency of time, devotion, and, if one were lucky, gossip. For if one worked close enough to the right nun, subtle scraps of convent drama might fall softly into one's ear. Sister Beatrice had a cousin who eloped with a pastry chef. Sister Clare had doubts that St. Ursula ever existed. Scandal in 6 syllables or less. They worked with everything from scratchy wool to noble silk, spinning from raw fibres when needed. And yes, the convent had its own spinning wheel room, a place of whirls and wheels and worries also spun into yarn. In truth, their stitches were prayers, every cross-stitch an amen, every knot a silent sermon. In this way, their labour became worship, and their worship, like much of what they did, was quiet, meticulous, and unexpectedly lovely. Sometimes they'd sew until their fingers went numb, or the morning bell tolled for lauds. Some whispered that the Virgin Mary herself embroidered clothing for baby Jesus. Others suspected she outsourced to angels. And so the convent breathed gently as sisters worked the needle, threading not just garments, but their place in the slow, sacred web of time. Now sleep, if you're not already. The needle hums on. And as gentle slippers shuffle down the hallway to the next duty, we'll follow next time into the dim flicker of the candle-making room, where wax melts and patience drips just as slow. Chapter 10. The Curious Case of Convent Cuisine. The convent kitchen, though rarely spoken of in sermons or whispered in prayer, was in many ways the pulsing heart of 18th century cloistered life. If silence was a golden virtue, then soup was its simmering soundtrack. And what aromatic songs they sang. Now, close your eyes, gently, of course, And imagine waking before sunrise in a stone-walled convent, somewhere nestled across the French countryside or tucked behind lavender fields in Tuscany. The dawn light warms the edge of your cot as bells ring out like sleepy yawns across the tiled halls. But before the morning's first psalm is even hummed, there's already a faint clatter from the kitchen cloisters. Pots, pans, ladles. Fire being coaxed from embers like secrets from a diary. Meals in a convent weren't flamboyant affairs. The nuns weren't there to dazzle the palate or flirt with flambé. Their table was one of simplicity, humility, and improbably excellent seasoning. Let's begin with bread. Always bread. If you were imagining those pale, crustless slices they give you in airplane meals, forget it. The 18th century convent loaf, likely coarse, dark, and baked by Sister Marguerite, who possibly did her kneading while reciting psalms, was hearty. It had enough substance to hold your gaze in prayer and your stomach in submission. Some were made from rye, others from barley, and many came out alarmingly dense, what historians have lovingly nicknamed holy doorstops. But the bread had companions. On ordinary days, the sisters might serve a thin vegetable broth. On feast days, you'd be permitted butter on it. Butter. A scandalous luxury, met with reverence and one or two silent hallelujahs. Root vegetables made frequent appearances. Carrots, leeks, onions. Humble things drawn from the garden with dirt still blushing on their skin. Whatever was in season became the menu. The sisters grew nearly everything themselves in gardens that were both spiritual sanctuaries and competitive arenas. Sister Maria had strong opinions about cabbage rows, particularly when Sister Agnes started mulching like a radical. Now and then, a fish would arrive. Fish, being the acceptable animal that dared not breathe air, slipped past strict rules about meat consumption. It was delivered fresh from nearby rivers or ponds maintained by local monks, who, let's be honest, probably gave them cheeky names like Saint Salmon or Brother Bass. Culinary excitement soared on Fridays when fish soup made its sacred rounds. It was often thin, but seasoned with such devotion one could almost taste the Latin Mass in it. There were fasts, of course, long, quiet, spiritual intervals, with very little chewing involved. During Lent, meals became even more austere. If the food before Lent had whispered, the food during Lent merely blinked at you. Nuns endured it not just with grace, but with gusto, sometimes even theorizing over dinner, whether hunger made one holier. Sister Benedicta called fasting a spiritual stretch of the belly. Sister Colette just called it Tuesday. Still, convent cuisine wasn't, in its entirety, a culinary purgatory. Some nuns had flair. Certain convents became quietly famous for their marmalades or dried quince sweets. Monastic preserves were genuine art, sweet salvation in a jar. There are recorded recipes from Italian convents that describe baking biscuits shaped like doves or hearts, most likely for holy days or visiting bishops with an incorrigible sweet tooth. One bishop once wrote that the nuns of Santa Caterina made a honey tart so divine, he was ready to canonize the pastry alongside the saints. Drinks, meanwhile, were modest. Water, occasionally wine, watered down and never scandalous. In colder climates, some convents brewed weak beer or herbal infusions. Chamomile from the herb garden, perhaps. A soft sleepiness in a cup. Of course, everything had rules. Rules on fasting days, rules on feast days, rules about fasting on feast days depending on your specific convent's interpretation of what heaven wanted from your diet. The rule of St. Benedict, the long-standing spiritual blueprint for monastic life, even included advice on how not to ask for a second serving. A meaningful lesson, though challenging when Sister Marguerite's lentil stew came out especially contemplative. And so it was, no excess, no gluttony, just quiet nourishment served beneath vaulted ceilings and humble wooden beams. Meals were communal, eaten in silence, accompanied by readings from scripture or the lives of saints, proving that dinner theatre even then was alive and well. Tucked in the warm shadows of convent walls, wrapped in a faint trace of cinnamon and cabbage, the sisters ate simply, their meals whispering the same prayer of peace as their hymns. A full stomach was fine, but a full soul, that was the true recipe. Now, as our stew simmers quietly to a close, let's tiptoe through the stone halls to another chamber, one where talents beyond cooking began to rise in secret and in silence. Chapter 11. The Convent's Secret Garden and the Art of Avoiding Turnips. There was a quiet sort of magic behind the convent walls, and it often sprouted on the edge of the herb garden, where thyme grew too boldly and the lavender leaned in to overhear gossip from the parsley. In this chapter, we take a barefoot step into the green heart of 18th century convent life, the garden. A place of labour, yes, but also of escape, both spiritual and slightly mischievous. Now, while many imagine nuns as always at prayer or embroidering saints with halos of perfect symmetry, a good portion of a nun's day involved kneeling in soil rather than chapel pews. This wasn't only an act of piety, it was necessity. The abbey grocery list couldn't be sent to town every week, especially when Sister Benedicta once accidentally ordered 200 onions instead of 2. So instead, they grew much of their own food, from carrots to cabbage, potatoes to pious pumpkins. Gardening was no small feat in full habit attire. If you've ever tried repotting basil in a cardigan, imagine digging trenches in wool while reciting Latin psalms and trying not to step on a beetle, because St. Francis liked all creatures, even the tiny crunchable ones. And yet, the sisters performed these duties with serenity, or at least with resigned muttering, that counted as prayer if whispered slow enough. But oh, the convent garden was more than beds and rows. It was a whispered sanctuary where age-old plant wisdom was passed like sacred scripture. Sister Hildegard, affectionately nicknamed the Herb Oracle, could cure anything with marjoram, aches, fevers, heartbreak, and the occasional bad haircut. She had a rare gift for combining holy water with rosemary in such a way that even the candle wax learned its manners. More than once, Sister Hildegard was found nurturing a particularly stubborn tomato vine, coaxing it to bear fruit with gentle chants and the promise of extra compost if it behaved. Some sisters swore the chilies bowed their little red heads when she walked past. Whether through divine intervention or sheer gardening prowess, harvests, in Sister Hildegard's watchful care, were miraculously abundant, except for the turnips. The turnips never really got on board. Turnips, in their usual stubborn fashion, were disliked by almost everyone, from novice to abbess. Yet they grew in abundance, unbothered by popularity contests or culinary opinion. There were whispered theories that the turnips were penance in root vegetable form. Recipes were invented and reinvented to make them palatable. Turnip soup, turnip stew, baked turnip, sanctified turnip hash, and something ominously titled Turnip Surprise, which was not so much a culinary breakthrough as an endurance test for the soul. Despite this, the garden remained a favorite place among the sisters. Birds flitted through fig trees, bees hummed in monastic harmonies, and somewhere between the lavender and leeks, sunlight managed to slip under the cloister's strict sense of order. It turned pewter skies into gold, cast a shimmering holiness even the strictest abbess didn't mind. In springtime, when the convent's orchard blushes with blossoms, the quiet joy was almost cheeky. Even the cats that prowled the garden, half-wild tabbies with names like Brother Whiskers and Saint Pounce-a-lot, would pause their holy mousework to stretch languidly in the sun. And when no one was watching, the youngest sisters would sometimes sneak an extra apple or sprig of mint, whispering that even Eve herself couldn't have resisted in such a well-tended Eden. Whether this was theological mischief or botanical justification, we may never know. Brambles, of course, were a nuisance, rose thorns and blackberry canes that tangled the hems of the habits and snagged sleeves like judgmental church ladies. But even these vexations had their charm, for within the rhythm of gardening, digging, planting, harvesting, there lay a rhythm of prayer, of presence, of peace. What better way to connect with creation than to gently, dutifully coax it from the dirt? And so the sisters tilled the earth, sowed with care, and occasionally had minor disputes over the placement of rutabagas. Nothing too scandalous, just firm opinions paired with shovels held in Christly restraint. A shadow stretched long across the convent wall, and the scent of warm thyme drifted through the cloisters like memory itself. The bells would call the sisters back inside, but in their sandals clung a bit of the garden, soil under the nails, green stains on sleeves, and perhaps, just perhaps, a single pilfered plum tucked beneath the scapula. And as dusk curled gently around the convent grounds, something soft blossomed too in the heart, an earthy holiness rooted in turnips and thyme. Next, under the hush of candlelight and the lull of creaking pews, we shall settle into the sacred quiet of evening prayer and the curious sounds it sometimes contained. Chapter 12 of Veils and Vespers, a day's end in linen and lullabies. As dusk sleepily draped itself over the stone walls of the convent, a soft breath of lavender and candle wax drifted through the corridors, weaving between wooden beams and weathered pews like a drowsy ghost with excellent taste in aromatics. Evening had arrived, quietly of course, and with it the slow exhale of the day's many little duties. The 18th-century convent, by now, had slipped into a familiar rhythm. Days were divided with all the precision of a particularly pious clock, and yet there was something enchantingly fluid about the late hours. This was the convent's golden hour, not in light, but in tone. A moment between obligation and sleep, when veils softened, voices turned whispery, and even the hard benches of the chapel seemed less committed to their sternness. Supper had just concluded, and as anyone who's dined on lentil stew for the 8th day in a row can attest, boredom does have a way of becoming rather comforting with time. The meal was consumed in silence, as was custom with many orders, unless it was a reading supper. In that case, one sister would recite scripture, the lives of saints, or, on especially daring nights, a dry botanical treatise, which somehow made the lentils even more thrilling by comparison. With bowls rinsed and conversation left respectfully unspoken, the sisters began easing into Compline, the final prayer service of the day. Named from the Latin completorium, meaning completion, it was the spiritual bedtime story of the monastic world. Imagine dim candlelight flickering against sandstone walls, the faint echo of Latin psalms gently brushing across the vaulted ceilings, and the soft rustle of habits as the sisters bowed their heads in steady rhythm. These women, nuns, novices, and the occasionally well-meaning lay sister who loved scrubbing too much to leave, stood in orderly rows, voices blending in a chant that was less about performance and more about presence. Vespers earlier in the evening had been grander, in that convent sort of way, full of lilting melodies and feathered incense. But Compline was simpler, shorter, sleepier, like tucking the soul into bed with a woolen spiritual blanket. After prayers, the sisters would file back into their modest cells, each with a straw mattress, a crucifix, and perhaps a single treasured item, like a tiny painting of the Virgin Mary or a pressed flower from the convent's garden, smuggled in as a misdemeanor of joy. The rooms were as uniform as a checkerboard, and you'd be hard-pressed to tell one nun's cell from another unless you had a deep passion for slight variations in woven bedspreads. There were rituals still, even in privacy. A nun might kneel for an extra prayer, stretch arthritic fingers softened by hours of scriptorium work, or scribble a reflection in the back of her breviary with ink that smelled faintly of iron and rain. If Sister Benedetta on the third floor had managed to sneak away a biscuit from supper, purely for spiritual contemplation, of course, now was the sacred hour of consumption. Convents were not places that encouraged indulgence, but small rebellions, like warm crumbs on a cold tongue, were sometimes seen as mercies disguised as sins. Silence enveloped the hall slowly. Conversations had long since tucked themselves beneath wimples. The only noises now were the occasional creak of old wood pondering its place in the universe, or the wind gently brushing against window panes in polite conversation. Fun fact, the wind has always respected curfews in convents. As the world outside darkened into indigo velvet, the convent itself faded into a dreamlike murmur. Time, thick and honeyed, moved slowly here. Clocks tick-tocked in Gregorian time, and the night's main villain was simply the cold stone floor. One's toes might meet during an ill-advised midnight trip to the privy. Still, even the privy breaks had a certain contemplative serenity to them, especially when moonlight lit the path, and everyone pretended not to notice how chilly things actually were. And so, beneath stars too modest to twinkle out loud, the women of the convent surrendered to the embrace of sleep. Some drifted off mid-prayer, others while counting rosary beads like sheep with halos. As the last candle sighed its smoky goodbye, and night wrapped her shawl tighter across the sky, something quiet and deeply, anciently gentle settled over the convent. The sort of peace that only comes when humans agree, collectively and silently, to let the world be, just for a few hours. Soon, in another part of the convent, gentle movement would stir once more, not of wakefulness, but of devotion. For even in sleep, the holy schedule pressed on. But first, the dreams, of gardens, of bells, of raindrops on cassocks and unexpected laughter in cloisters. And of course, the quietest rebellion of all, the morning that always waits just beyond matins. Chapter 13. Candlelight and Copybooks, the secret scribbles of sister scribes. On the quiet, worn desks of 18th-century convents, beneath the watchful eyes of ink-splattered angels and dusty crucifixes, an invisible world flickered in candlelight. It was the gentle realm of the scriptorium, where prayers were whispered with quills and women turned thoughts into loops of cursive laced with devotion. Now, we mustn't assume every convent was hosting a team of medieval illuminators painting gold halos with squirrel hair brushes. No, by the 1700s, the labour of medieval manuscript copying had largely given way to more practical pursuits, writing letters, copying religious texts, recording births in the parish register, and occasionally, ever so quietly, composing a line or two of private poetry. The refectory was for soup, the chapel was for songs, but the scriptorium, or simply the writing room, was for secrets, usually of the divine variety, spilled in sepia ink. Picture it now. Long, narrow tables covered in parchment, beeswax candles flickering against the chalk-white walls, and the soft scratching of quills filling the air like a murmuring stream. Sister Agnes, perhaps, writes slowly, her tongue caught delicately between her teeth in concentration. Sister Magdalena next to her hums a hymn off-key while trying desperately to reread her own handwriting, though she suspects it now resembles a recipe for confusion. Not all nuns had the luxury of literacy, but many did learn to read and write inside convent walls, especially in orders devoted to education or contemplation. In fact, in some convents, women received a better education than many of the men outside them. Latin, French, music, arithmetic, even a dabble in botany or philosophy made their occasional appearance among ink-stained fingers. And those fingers, let's not romanticize too heavily. They were frequently cramped, cold and smudged. Quills needed trimming every few lines, inkpots tipped over like rebellious cats, and parchment was expensive, so mistakes had to be scraped away with a sharpened knife called a penknife. Rest assured, gentle listener, the cutting edge of education was at times very literal. To warm their hands and hearts, nuns often wrote letters, not always to bishops or patrons, but sometimes to each other, lending little comforts across the cloister. A note tucked under a pillow of straw, a birthday wish inked discreetly on a prayer card. And yes, while unauthorized love letters were technically banned, some convents hosted correspondence more dramatic than a Spanish telenovela. Sister Caterina in Naples once addressed her lover with such florid, flowery Latin that the bishop suspected she might be composing operas under her veil. But mostly, the writing was quiet and purposeful. A nun might copy out the rule of Saint Benedict, adding her own invisible notes in the margins. "Do not oversleep," she'd underline twice, and then scribble beside it, "Too late now." Some convents also produced keepsake books known as spiritual journals. These were part diary, part theological reflection, and part pep talk to one's soul. Bound in leather, tied with a ribbon, and stored beneath pillows or altar cloths, they were the ancestors of today's locked journals. If your deepest secrets included meditations on the nature of original sin and whether Sister Joan is stealing your turn on the organ. The act of writing was, for many cloistered women, a path both inward and upward. Even in silence, ink became a voice. Paper became a landscape where thoughts tiptoed barefoot. A prayer written with care could feel more permanent than one whispered in the chapel's echo. And through these humble scribbles, history has heard them. Indeed, some surviving manuscripts are miniature masterpieces. Pages delicately ruled in red ink, initials taller than your thumb, margins populated with curious doodles, cats, saints, fish with halos. No one is ever quite sure whom to thank for those, but someone somewhere gave a halo to a tuner, and we're here for it. The rhythm of convent life often mirrored prose itself, ordered, repetitive, still spirited in its own way. Morning penance, midday ink stains, evening prayers, perhaps with some paper-thin spiritual pondering logged before bed. All under that soft candlelight which glowed gold against the silvering hair of older sisters bent in thought. And so, in the hush of these scriptoriums, we find not just ink, but memory, a legacy looped in careful script from the fingertips of women who dreamed in Latin, sighed in rhyme, and sometimes nodded off mid-sentence, quills still poised gallantly in hand. Now, let your eyelids grow heavy as we prepare to wander next through the sounds of convent music, the other language in which nuns whispered to the divine. Chapter 14. Of Lace and Letters. The convent's little library. The convent at twilight was hushed in a way that suggested centuries had exhaled and decided to rest. Evening bells had faded into wistful memory, and all was settled save the gentle creaking of floorboards and the occasional dignified sneeze from Sister Apollonia, who insisted dust was simply a challenge from God to be met with decorum. Tonight, we quietly pad down the cool stone corridor to a narrow wooden door, painted once and now vaguely the colour of old parchment, behind which nestled a secret treasure far more stirring than gold, the convent's library. Now, to manage your expectations, this was not the papal archives or even a scandalous aristocrat's private reading salon. It was, however, quaint beyond compare. About 100 volumes in total, some stacked sideways for lack of shelf space, with tiny moths fluttering like sleepy librarians. The smell was heavenly, for those who love a mildly musty bouquet of time, ink, and ideas safely trapped on vellum. Reading, for a conventual sister in the 18th century, was both spiritual duty and delightful luxury. And like so many things in life, it came with a healthy layer of rules. Books, you see, were powerful tools, so powerful, in fact, that the Church thoughtfully ensured the library's contents were approved by someone who wore an alarming amount of red velvet. The collection mirrored this caution. Lives of saints who were almost suspiciously good at not complaining. Theological texts with titles longer than actual sentences, and, tucked behind a slightly warped piece of panelling, one rather saucy, if still pious, translation of St. Teresa's ecstatic visions. No one admitted to putting it there, but everyone had clearly read it. The most popular book? That honour went to a weather-worn copy of Herbarium of Sancta Clara, a charming, if slightly confused herbal manual that claimed lavender cured melancholy, basil protected one from gout and sin in equal measure, and chamomile pleased angels. Sister Rufina once brewed tea from it that launched a 3-day discussion on whether hiccups were demonic. But the library was more than its books. It was a sacred space for thought. Here, nuns wrote letters to distant sisters or family members, composed contemplative verse, interpreted scripture, or, if it was a particularly quiet Thursday, designed astonishingly ornate calligraphy for table place cards that would never be used. Who was the calligraphed Lady Abbess Araminta of the Scones meant to be? We may never know, but her name turned up in the margins of several texts, including the Psalms. Now, let's pause a moment for the quills. Yes, quills, because no proper nun in 1760 would deface the margins of the life of Saint Jerome without the right feather. Each sister had her preference. Sister Genevieve liked goose. It made her feel serious. Sister Agnes wrote only with swan because, she said, it warded off melancholic ink blobs. Speaking of ink, it was mixed in-house with reverent flair. Oak galls, certainly. Vinegar, a generous dash. Iron salts, of course. And just a hint of secret ingredient known only to Sister Philippa, who giggled suspiciously any time it was mentioned. It turned the manuscript margins a suspicious shade of plum, but no one wished to confront her about it. The act of writing was both meditative and expressive. Some chronicled their daily thoughts in soft Latin. Others copied down favourite prayers or snippets of poetic daydreams. There were, incidentally, at least 5 copies of a hymn to the sunbeam that touched the garden wall. It's unclear whether this was plagiarism or a scribes' club project, but it certainly made for lovely ink practice. Once a week, they held what only the sisters referred to as the scriptorium soiree, a supremely quiet gathering where they read aloud select passages and offered commentary that was 3-part spiritual discussion and 1-part subtle competition to see who had discovered the saint with the most unusual backstory. Saint Drogo, it turns out, was a perennial hit, a patron saint of unattractive people who could also bilocate, which opened many theological and imaginative possibilities. No chapter meeting ended without a toast, of warm milk, of course, with cinnamon if it was a feast day. As dusk deepened and candles flickered in the library's cool embrace, the sisters would close their books, blot their pages with elegant sighs, and return the world of parchment to shadows until the next quiet moment. The library, small though it was, had given them permission to think, to wonder, and to dream while staying firmly cloistered within the bounds of obedience and heavy oak doors. And now, as our candle wanes and the sleeping convent hums with breath and peace, we shall gently slip from parchment and plum ink into more domestic realms. For as we'll see next, even sisters must sew. And goodness, what embroidery they stitched. Chapter 15. The Mysterious Case of Sister Odilia's Cheese Riddle. By the mid-afternoon hours in the convent, when sunlight slanted across the stone floors and cast long stripes upon the frescoes, our dear 18th century nuns had completed prayers, swept the corridor twice more than the dust required, and were on the precipice of their sacred daily ritual. Cheese. Yes, cheese. Not just any cheese, mind you. This was the famed convent triple fermentation soft rind of St. Clotilde, a cheese so lovingly delicate and faintly herby that it made even the strictest abbess close her eyes in reverent appreciation when nibbling it between psalms. It was here, in this blissfully brined chapter of convent life, that we encounter Sister Odilia, a nun of uncommon cunning, and the only woman west of the Rhine who could both recite the rule of St. Benedict and perfectly ferment dairy. Sister Odilia was something of a local legend. With her perpetually flour-dusted skirts and keen, knowing smile, she had a knack for turning milk into metaphysical wonder, which is why, on a spring Tuesday around the year 1746, it caused no small panic when she arrived at the refectory with only half a wheel of cheese and a cryptic note pinned to her apron, reading, "Only those who chew in silence shall taste truth." A riddle about cheese, delivered by a nun. Naturally, curiosity swept through the convent faster than a rumour about a visiting bishop. Sister Scholastica nearly dropped her knitting. Sister Marguerite gasped so loudly that her latest embroidery, a rather intricate depiction of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, gained an accidental sunbeam bursting from the wrong side of the iron grate. And the abbess? She narrowed her eyes in a way that meant one of two things. Either she was about to quote Cistercian dietary restrictions, or she was thirsty for ecclesiastical intrigue. Mercifully, it was the latter. "Let it be known," she pronounced calmly, "that we shall all eat in silence today and await enlightenment." And so it was that 27 nuns of varying ages and varying degrees of curiosity sat in pointed silence, nibbling their way through modest bits of this devotional dairy. There were no clinks of cutlery, no hushed chatter, just the soft, reverent crunch of bread crust and the dreamy squish of semi-soft cheese against molar. What followed was nothing, at least at first. But then Sister Beatrix, barely 19, and still learning how to keep her veil balanced when nodding, raised her hand, with her mouth quite appropriately full of cheese, eyes turned toward her. Slowly, dreamily, she swallowed and said in a whisper, "I tasted rosemary, but no rosemary grows in our herb garden." Murmurs brewed, because she was quite right. Then another sister stood, old Sister Dorothy, who'd survived the plague, a lightning strike, and a week locked in the cellar after dozing off during Compline. She too whispered. There was a note inside the rind. Gasps of the subdued and polite variety circulated as Sister Dorothy gently produced a strip of waxed parchment. On it were the words, "In the quiet dairy, truth stamps its hoof." Now, what did this mean? Was truth a cow? Was there a deeper theological meaning in dairy animals that had somehow evaded Thomas Aquinas? Historians regret to inform you, dear listener, that to this day, the precise meaning of Sister Odilia's cheese riddle remains one of conventual history's coziest enigmas. Some said it was a metaphor for inner peace. Others thought it a sensory test. Still others believed Sister Odilia had simply gotten into the elderflower cordial the night before. But what we can say for certain is that from that day on, no nun ever rushed their mealtime again. Silence during the cheese course became an honoured tradition. Morsels were tasted with intention. Bread was broken like ancient philosophers contemplating life's big quests over a midnight snack. And in the heart of that echoing stone convent, nestled among candle smoke and the scent of rosemary that may or may not have been real, a deeper quiet settled in, one that held space for mystery and joy and cheese. As the last rays of sunlight drew slow golden fingers across the worn wooden tables, Sister Odilia beamed softly. She'd never explained the riddle, not in this life, but that, she thought, was rather the point. Tomorrow's dawn would bring a new custom, a new chapter in their sleepy little tale. Perhaps we shall soon hear about Sister Heloise and the scandalous incident of the flying cassock. But not just yet. For now, let us rest in the gentle afterglow of dairy dreams and silence nobler than gold. Chapter 16, of Saints, Suppers, and the Subtle Politics of Porridge. The sun, or what was left of it, slipped behind the convent's tall stone walls like a bashful guest, excusing itself from a party it never meant to attend. Vespers had been sung, candles fluttered gently in thick air, and now the convent's residents turned their attention to the most sacred and unavoidably shared ritual of the day, supper. Ah, convent suppers. When one thinks of nuns in the 18th century, cloistered away from the rattle of the outside world, one might imagine ceaseless prayer, woolen gowns, and the faint scent of beeswax and humility. What doesn't immediately spring to mind, though it should, is the very real, very political world of convent cuisine. Evening meals in most convents were simple, humble, one might say. But this humbleness was also artful. Supper might include a lukewarm vegetable pottage, a slice or two of coarse bread, and sometimes, if the day was particularly celebratory, or the abbess in a wildly magnanimous mood, a small portion of fish, very small, the kind of fish that makes peasants smug and cats ask for seconds. Meals were taken in silence, spoken words replaced by meaningful glances or, if necessary, exaggerated mime. After several weeks, the average nun became quite fluent in the gestural equivalent of "please pass the stale loaf," and I believe Sister Marguerite just sneezed in the soup again. It was at supper that the social hierarchies within the convent revealed themselves not with words, but with the unspoken language of seating arrangements. The most senior nuns sat closest to the abbess, who presided over meals like a holy umpire with a ladle. Novices and lay sisters, the helpfully unpaid employees of God, sat farther away, often within scent, but not sight of the kitchen. Meals followed the strict rule of St. Benedict, which had, for centuries, governed monastic life with loving rigidity. According to this sacred script, meals were to be moderate, though it didn't specify just how moderate you could get before dinner became an existential metaphor. And yet, despite the ascetic reputation, convent kitchens were far from dull. On feast days, those culinary cathedrals sprang to life. Recipes for these rare occasions tiptoed the line between frugality and flair. Eggs were sometimes stuffed. Apples were baked with honey and a whisper of spice. Lentils were dressed up to taste like something that disliked being lentils. These were small, edible rebellions, sanctified by occasion and justified by centuries of tradition. Now, one must pause here to mention Sister Ambrosia, the convent's unofficial soup oracle. She was neither the floor cook nor the kitchen manager, but she had an uncanny talent for predicting what was coming out of the ancient cauldron simply by sniffing the hallway. Her nose, like her soul, had been gently honed by decades of quiet devotion and under-seasoned broth. It was Sister Ambrosia who, legend had it, once detected burnt parsnips from 2 corridors away and orchestrated a perfectly timed hymnal accident that allowed for a discreet pot substitution. The abbess, grateful, honoured her not with words, obviously, but with a linen napkin hand-embroidered with a remarkably accurate rendering of a soup pot. As the nuns sat in their appointed rows, spoons clinking gently against wooden bowls, the sound was more lullaby than dining cacophony. In the corner, a designated reader, tonight Sister Beatrice, who prided herself on clarity and not looking up when dogs barked, read aloud from the lives of the saints. The stories floated on the heavy air like incense trails, dreamy tales of martyrs and miracles told in the same unwavering tone used to list chores or report a lost shoe. And lo, Saint Felicity of Rome had refused to renounce her faith, even while enduring 39 days of dietary restrictions far more severe than this soup. In fact, one nun whispered to another, she may have invented oatless oatmeal, or as it was called at the time, hope porridge. After supper, the bowls were quietly gathered, the benches pushed in, and the nuns filed out with the slow, sacred choreography of those whose feet belonged more to the earth than their eyes did. The kitchen would now rest until morning. The fire banked low. The ladles hung like sleepy sentinels. Outside, night had claimed the cloister, wrapping it in velvet quietude. And inside, the nuns, stomachs modestly filled, souls gently nourished, prepared for another rite, the evening examination of conscience, which would begin not with guilt, but with gratitude, kind of like spiritual flossing. And as we slip into those candle-lit corridors once more, let's follow Sister Benedette, who's just remembered where she last saw her rosary, curiously near the dormitory sock basin, which brings us gently into the mysterious realm of nightly habits in holy halls. Chapter 17 of Cabbages and Communal Soup. Dining in the Convent. Evening in the convent descended like a feather, quiet and slow, brushing over the stone corridors with a gentle hush. The bells had already chimed vespers, echoing through the garden like a polite yawn, and the sisters began drifting toward the refectory in lines of quiet, slippered feet. It was mealtime. Not a feast, but a ritual, as dependable as stars, and nearly as old. The meals in an 18th century convent were, to put it delicately, an exercise in modesty rather than indulgence. You would not find roast pheasant or pastries dusted with sugar unless they had been smuggled in by a mischievous niece who felt guilty about marrying a baron. More likely, the evening's menu featured some version of boiled legumes paired with something courageous called black bread, which was, depending on the region, either a hearty rye loaf or an unsettling experiment in grain-based humility. Supper was the lightest meal of the day in both nutrition and spirit, and was often accompanied by a reading from scripture or some saintly biography meant to discourage gluttony and, simultaneously, reduce the appetite. Eating in silence was the golden rule, broken only for essential communication, such as asking for more turnip water or alerting the table that Sister Bertha's soup had begun to ferment again. This solemn quiet was called the Great Silence, though some sisters used it as an opportunity for wordless communication far more expressive than any sermon. A raised eyebrow here, a sideways glance there. The careful stringing of spoon clinks into subtle conversational Morse code, in that way peculiar to human beings. Even enforced silence became a kind of language. Meals were taken at long wooden tables, well worn by centuries of elbows, and slightly sticky in humid weather. The seating arrangement allowed no preference. Mother Abbess might have her place, but the rest was an egalitarian spread of linen smocks and varying levels of patience for turnips. Now, one might ask, what did these meals actually taste like? And the answer is, not much. For while the sisters cared deeply for the soul, they did not believe in exciting the palate. Seasonings such as salt were used conservatively, and pepper was eyed suspiciously, so assertive, so worldly. The vegetables were boiled until repentantly soft. The bread was often baked in large communal loaves that required sawing rather than slicing, and the cheese could be described, on particularly brave days, as celibate. But there was something quietly beautiful in this monkish menu. The food, though simple, was shared. Every meal was an act of community, a temporary still life in clay bowls and wooden spoons, a reminder of how very rarely anything we eat is really about food alone. It was about labor, ritual, self-restraint, and, on more mischievous evenings, the small thrill of noticing when Sister Clare snuck an extra apple under her sleeve. Now, lest you think convent cuisine was all doom and damp lentils, let us spare a reverent thought for feast days. On high holy days and saintly commemorations, the convent kitchen roared to life in an eruption of pot-clattering joy. Sweet wafers might be pressed. Honey was occasionally permitted. Eggs featured boldly, and there might even be fish for those orders daring enough to flirt with extravagance. The sisters would walk a little faster to the refectory on those nights, sleeves swishing gently, stomachs whispering encouragement. But even then, decorum remained. No elbows on the table, no eye-rolling if the pudding curdled, and above all, never laugh into your lentils, not unless you wanted a long talk with Mother Euchoria about the dangers of unchecked mirth. As the meal ended, a bell would ring, and the sisters would stand in unison, bow to the crucifix hanging over the head table, and file out once more into the gloaming, their hunger mostly satisfied, their discipline much the same. The kitchen, meanwhile, returned to silence. A few embers glowed with gentle memory in the stove. The benches cooled. Somewhere, a mouse considered the merits of boiled cabbage left too close to the windowsill. Outside, night crept over the cloisters. The stars nodded their heads in the chill dark above, and the convent slumbered deeper into its holy rhythm. And beyond the refectory's heavy doors, another gathering was beginning, under quieter arches and by candlelight, because next, the sisters would pray. Chapter 18. The Whisper of the Cloister Garden. If there was one place in an 18th century convent where time seemed to fold in on itself like a well-worn prayer book, it was the garden. Tucked in the heart of the cloister, gently hemmed by stone corridors and the careful geometry of the convent's architecture, The garden was less a burst of nature and more a curated breath of heaven, precisely clipped, modestly flowering, and always humming with the quiet discipline of both plants and people. Here, amidst lavender hedges and rosemary sprigs, dried rose petals sprinkled from the rosary processions still lingered near thorny stems. The sisters believed in dualities. The garden must be both Eden and Gethsemane. A place of sweetness, yes, but also one where sorrow had once sweated through the leaves. In between moments of prayer or tending to laundry that had seen better decades, the nuns would come here to trim, to think, and to speak, softly, if anyone was even speaking at all. In truth, the convent garden was the one place where conversation could turn, ever so gently treasonous. Picture it, Sister Magdalena, whose roses had more blooms than several of the chapel's regulars had teeth. She swore by moon pruning, although no one entirely knew whether she meant cutting at the full moon, or simply when the moon watched her with approval. And Sister Agnes, quick with both the shears and a side glance, relaying, or perhaps inventing, a tale about the bishop who once sniffed a lily, sneezed mightily, and declared it a sign that he'd follow no earthly scent, but that of the Lord's judgment. And so they pruned, not just plants, but thoughts. Gossip was trimmed like ivy, not so much removed as quietly trained to grow in safer directions. One might assume the garden was all for show, or solace, but no, it had industry too. Medicinal herbs were quietly coaxed into life by weathered fingers and patient hearts. Lemon balm for nerves, chamomile for sore eyes and sore tempers, and lovage, because every convent, no matter how holy, still dealt with digestion issues. Not every miracle is spectacular. The physic beds, where the most useful herbs were grown, were laid out in simple symmetry. This was not vanity, but theology in bloom. Order reflected the eternal harmony of God's design, or so said the abbess, as she directed Sister Colette to dig in straighter lines. Colette's lines were wobbly at best. She claimed that her shovel followed the path the Holy Spirit whispered. Others suspected she had poor depth perception. Indeed, tending the garden was one of the few labours where solitude could be softly disguised as duty. Some sisters preferred the stooped communion of their hands in the soil to the rigid joy of communal embroidery. Soil forgives uneven stitches. Soil listens without correction. Evenings brought a special hush to the garden. As the sun flattened itself across the convent walls, bellflowers closed like tired mouths, and birds, those disrespectful, optimistic creatures, fluttered off to sing somewhere else. Crickets tuned their instruments. A breeze might pull the scent of holy basil through the arches, convincing at least one sleepy novice that perhaps sanctity did have a smell. There were pathways through the garden with names known only to the sisters. The path of St. Silence, which was just the shaded walk between the apothecary and the laundry, became the place to walk when your soul was weary, but your hands were too sore to keep knitting. The East Pilgrimage, a stretch of 10 paces looping around the rosemary plant, was commonly trodden when one had overindulged, on dried figs usually, and was seeking both forgiveness and fresher air. Not all was stately. There were gardening accidents. Once, Sister Edith attempted to transplant what she firmly declared was a holy turnip. It turned out to be a stone. The sisters gave it a name and painted a halo on it. They called it Saint Rutabaga for years. The garden was a comfort, an outlet, a prayer made of petal and root. It was, in its own way, a silent confession booth. Everything told you something if you listened right. The droop of a daisy, the stubbornness of the mint, The way the vines slowly but absolutely covered everything in the end. And if the walls could talk, they wouldn't. This was a convent after all. Now, as moonlight begins to cast soft silver down into the courtyard, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine makes its unhurried rounds, we'll drift next toward a place where parchment sings and quills no secrets. The convent's very own scriptorium. Chapter 19. The Secret Language of Needles and Thread. Long before Pinterest boards and cross-stitch kits arrived in rustic gift shops, the women of 18th century convents were stitching their way into both history and humility with threads finer than a spider's sigh. Tonight we drift quietly into the embroidery room, a place where silence was golden, but gold thread was even better. You see, embroidery in the convent wasn't mere idle tedium. It was a somewhat sacred occupation, part prayer, part artistic expression, part, unpaid skilled labor. The nuns, seated in rows or clusters like elegant birds at prayer, spent hours hunched with needles dancing obediently between cloth and candlelight, murmuring soft Ave Marias with every passing stitch. For many convents, particularly the wealthier ones nestled in cities like Paris or Naples, embroidery was a source of income and prestige. These were no kitschy tea towel designs, no home sweet cell samplers. Here, fingers toiled to birth opulent altar cloths, ecclesiastical vestments, and silk-stitched commissions requested by bishops, barons, and at least one duchess with extremely specific embroidery tastes. She wanted a grapevine motif featuring exactly 11 grapes per bunch, no more, no less. The convent's embroidery room would have smelled like beeswax, old wool, lavender sachets, and just the faintest whiff of warm bread from the kitchen wing, a place of calm industry. Sister Marguerite, leaning over a hoop of linen stretched tight like a tiny trampoline, might have told the cloth her secrets, letting her needle carry them into the folds. Sister Louisa, meanwhile, had mastered satin stitch so thoroughly that some whispered she could make angels blush with envy. Though officially, of course, humility forbade such reactions. Now, you might wonder, were they allowed to get creative? Could a bored nun stitch a tiny moon into the corner of St. Augustine's robe? Technically, no. But was it done? Very possibly. A butterfly here, a hidden monogram there, revenge doodles against Mother Superior were more likely passive than aggressive, taking the form of unusually gloomy cherubs. The embroidery was not only decorative, but also devotional. Each stitch, when done in silence and contemplation, was offered up as a type of prayer. Ora et labora, pray and work, was more than just a mantra. It was the warp and weft of conventual life. Every flick of the needle could be an act of penance or a petition in thread. And then there were the threads themselves. Silk dyed with crushed cochineal beetles, indigo plants, saffron, and even the hushed shimmer of metallic threads, gold and silver wound around fine linen or horsehair. Imagine the soft sound of it unwinding in thin coils, glinting like quiet stars waiting to find their place on a bishop's chasuble. Tools were kept neatly, bone-handled scissors shaped like tiny herons, pin cushions plump as scones, and thread windows carved from ivory or mother of pearl, some even shaped like hearts, reminding those labouring hands that even in silence, their devotion was stitched with love. Most important of all, no nun sewed alone in spirit. Embroidery was a communal act, even if nobody spoke. There was something profoundly comforting in the shared rhythm of busy hands. Like a murmured chant, it bound them together tighter than any sin ever could. A convent might be secluded, even cloistered, But in that embroidery room was a quiet roar of purpose and legacy. Larger convents even taught embroidery to girls from wealthy families sent there for a season or a decade. One might learn etiquette, Latin psalms, and how to applique a dove so delicately it looked airborne. Such skill carried status when one returned to worldly life, and besides, a daughter of station must be proficient not just in French verbs, but in French knots. And so, Sister Anne's wrist would ache softly by the hour. Sister Pilar would squint into the woolen dusk of a tapestry in progress, and somewhere, perhaps unknowingly, future historians would preserve these threads as artifacts of holy patience and unsung artistry. As the candles burn lower and the threads are wound away for another day, the embroidery room returns to stillness, because in the convent, night always follows duty like a second shadow, soft and watchful. And speaking of shadows, next, we shall quietly follow the cloistered path of penmanship and parchment, because nothing says divine serenity quite like copying scripture, one Latin vowel at a time. Chapter 20. The clock strikes vespers, a symphony of sacred routine. By the time the late afternoon shadows had stretched themselves like lazy cats across the convent corridors, signaling the approach of vespers, the entire rhythm of day life within the convent seemed to shift. Everything slowed, softened, as if even the dust motes caught in shafts of golden light had agreed on a moment of solemn poise. Vespers was the evening prayer service, the second to last liturgical checkpoint in the well-charted waters of a nun's day. It usually began just as the sun was contemplating retirement, lighting the chapel windows into glowing panes of celestial honey. For the sisters, Vespers was both a spiritual punctuation mark and an unscheduled sigh, a promise that supper wasn't too far behind. You must understand, time in a convent did not belong to clocks or calendars, but to bells and the soft echo of footsteps. For 18th century nuns, life tilted perpetually toward the sacred, but also toward the predictably practical. And Vespers was where that balance shone most sweetly, half in prayer, half in longing for the evening broth. In convents following the rule of St. Benedict, which was more of a lifestyle guide than a strict itinerary, think Zen and the art of monastic living, the day was divided into 8 canonical hours, each with its own name, Latin personality, and inclination for punctuality. Vespers came after none, not the sister, but the hour around mid-afternoon, and before Compline, which snuggled in just before bed. As the bell tolled, sisters moved toward the chapel with the gentle murmur of skirts and quiet contemplation. They wore their habits like shadows wear dusk, gently, with a certain understated flair. Gone were the novitiate giggles or the clatter of kitchen pans. Now came the sacred hush. The chapel itself was usually modest, with wooden pews polished by centuries of sleepy forearms, a few flickering beeswax candles, and the lingering scent of lavender from someone's overzealous use of cleaning herbs. Even bird songs seemed to fall respectfully silent at vespers, as if the starlings themselves were Benedictines in disguise. The music of vespers was Gregorian chant, a hypnotic blend of ethereal melodies intended to lift the soul while giving the body something pleasantly repetitive to do. Remarkably, this chant offered no harmony, no instruments, no catchy chorus. Just one voice, then a few more, all rising and falling like waves, meant for the spirit rather than the dance floor. For many nuns, this chanting was both the highlight and quiet heartbreak of the day. It was beautiful, yes, but also secretly a test of endurance, much like reading Latin upside down by candlelight, which some of the more curious sisters had attempted. Sister Colette, for instance, could chant beautifully while also regretting not having a biscuit before chapel, a truly saintly sacrifice. Vespers required attention, not just because the psalms could get rather poetic in their demands, but also because the choir mistress had ears like a bat and a memory like an abbot's ledger. A missed note here, a yawn disguised as reverence there, all noted politely but firmly on invisible parchment. Yet, despite its structured solemnity, Vespers was oddly comforting, like slipping into a favorite sweater that always smells faintly of frankincense and old books. The Psalms may have been ancient, but their themes, hope, fear, gratitude, fatigue, the occasional smiting, resonated deeply with nuns who had spent most of the day either with boiling turnips or chasing mice from the wheat stores. And once the final Amen lingered into silence, like the last syrupy drop from a prayer jug, the sisters would rise, bow, and drift from the chapel as if they were leaves on a sacred breeze, calm, restored, and peacefully peckish. Some of the younger nuns believed that Vespers kept the night from misbehaving. They imagined that each prayer soothed the moon before it rose, wrapping it in lullabies. Of course, others simply appreciated that Vespers meant only one more service, Compline, stood between them and the glorious, if slightly lumpy, warmth of bed. Now, let us leave the sisters basking in that post-prayer quiet, their souls gently tuned like chapel bells on a windless evening. The sun has slipped behind the horizon now, just in time for a modest supper, and a little something unexpected that stirred the convent after dusk. Chapter 21. Of laundry, linen, and the cloistered art of cleanliness. Despite what one might assume about serene stone walls and the vow of poverty, things still got dirty inside an 18th century convent, and someone, usually several someones, had to clean them. Thus, we arrive at the often overlooked but astonishingly sudsy subject, convent laundry. Now, if you're imagining tumble dryers and a whirring spin cycle, I must pause your imagination politely, set it down, thank it for its service, and gently send it on its way. Laundry in the 1700s didn't so much force you to break a sweat, it stole your entire afternoon and sometimes your will to live with it. Convent laundry was a ritual unto itself, an act of devotion mixed with lye soap and a disturbing number of frocks in urgent need of attention. The nuns operated on a cycle, not unlike the moon and one's emotional stability, that usually set aside specific days for washwork. These were lovingly known as washing days, although lovingly might be generous. Reluctantly but obediently known is perhaps truer to the spirit. The washing began with gathering the communal garments, tunics, veils, aprons, handkerchiefs, and things politely referred to in Latin, so no one had to be too specific. Everything was sorted with the care of holy archivists, with linens from the chapel handled even more reverently than the novices' socks, which, incidentally, were always 3 inches from where they absolutely should have been. The communal washing took place near a stream or, if the convent was fancy beyond its cross-stitched humility, a stone washhouse near a well or cistern. Wooden troughs or large copper cauldrons were filled with blessedly heated water, then stirred with a wooden paddle large enough to double as a defensive weapon in troubling times, of which 18th century Europe had a few. Soap was made within the convent naturally, a mixture of animal fat and ash from the kitchen hearth. It did the job reasonably well, though it smelled like a moral compromise, cleansing yet faintly reminiscent of last Tuesday's mutton stew. Some convents employed a technique called bucking, It sounds like a cheerful rural dance, but actually involves quietly pouring hot lye water over piles of clothes and letting it trickle through, like a slow-moving waterfall of slightly caustic hygiene. This process took hours, sometimes days, and was supervised with the kind of reverent boredom typically reserved for watching bread rise or paint dry on stone in real time. Washing was, of course, only half the adventure. Drying involved lines strung across cloisters or gardens, with white linens flapping like ghostly flags of surrender to the breeze. In bad weather, of which there was plenty, laundry was dried in garrets beside hearths, or rolled up and prayed over in the hope that Saint Veronica, or someone equally sympathetic and handy with a towel, would intercede. Then came the folding. Folding in a convent was not merely mechanical, it was spiritual origami. Every hem aligned like saints in a procession. Every crease was a quiet acknowledgement of divine order. This was the true monastery aesthetic. Not minimalism, but maximal tidiness. Interestingly, the role of laundress, especially the chief laundress who oversaw supplies, soap ratios, and who may or may not have absconded with the convent's last usable scrubbing brush, was one of significant responsibility. She was part chemist, part project manager, part listener of whispered gossip about whose stockings had worn thin from excessive pacing during contemplative prayer. She saw and knew everything, every stain and every story behind it. Sometimes novices served in the laundry to learn humility. And indeed, few activities teach humility faster than wringing out Sister Barbara's winter bloomers while reciting Psalm 51. And yet, there was camaraderie. Under the steaming fog of boiled linens and the gentle thunder of garments being thumped against stones, there was laughter. Jokes passed quietly down the line. Songs were hummed and then sung outright. Ballads about saints and sinners, about the abbess's cat, who had once allegedly fallen into the starch bucket and emerged whiter than the Lamb of God. Laundry was work, but like all things inside the convent walls, it became something more, a work of the hands that cleanse the soul, a reminder that even under vows of simplicity and chastity, humans, especially women, still must scrub, soak, and sigh about the drying weather. And as the sun set on another washing day, linens fluttered in the breeze like secret prayers to the wind, quiet, clean, and utterly ordinary. The sacred and the mundane folded together, line by line. Next, we drift into the convent kitchens, where silence met bubbling broth, and recipes were guarded as fiercely as relics. Chapter 22. The Mystery of Midnight Bread and the Secret Yeast Society. As moonbeams dappled the stone corridors of our convent, casting silvery nets across the flagstones, an aroma would rise, slow and warm and yeasty, from the kitchens below. It was not quite holy incense. It was bread, but not just any bread. Secret bread. Now, one might suppose that in an 18th century convent where vows of poverty and fashion-free humility reigned supreme, carbs would be humble and sparse. And yes, in theory, loaves were rationed with the precision of a confessor's eyebrow arch. But in practice, sisters have always found ways to practice minor miracles. Chief among them, the Midnight Baking Club. No one ever officially acknowledged its existence. It was never written in ledgers, and certainly never blessed by the abbess. But if you happened to awaken at just the right whisper of the hour, and follow your nose past shuttered cloisters and snoring novices, you might stumble upon Sister Benedetta, reputedly mute except when correcting Latin, shaping rolls with curious devotion. Or Sister Ursulina, a woman usually so strict, she once scolded a window for letting in too much breeze, giving the dough an encouraging jiggle, as though to coax it towards sanctity. You see, despite the convent's rigid rules and unyielding schedules, bread making became a sanctioned rebellion. Not the loud kind, mind you, but the slow, delicious resistance of flour and thyme. By day, meals were simple. Watered soup that often tasted like warm regret, or boiled roots seasoned with a smidge too much penitence. But occasionally, the sisters would appear at breakfast fatigue-eyed but strangely joyful, and in the center of the table, like a crowned relic, would sit a still warm loaf, round, golden, and fragrant with secrets. "Where did it come from?" the younger novices whispered, reverently tearing pieces. "The baker only delivers on Wednesdays." And the older sisters would smile like cats who'd slept in sunbeams and say nothing at all. The official story, if one were brave or foolish enough to ask, was that Sister Domitilla had prayed it into being, a theological loophole no one dared question. But those in the know, those who observed the telltale flour smudges on hymnals or the faint clink of measuring spoons after compline, knew the truth. There was a secret yeast society operating under cover of piety and steam. There were code words naturally. "The chalice runneth over" meant the sponge was frothy. "The hour of rising is nigh" signalled the proofing was perfect. And if someone nodded and murmured, "Lo, the bread is many, but the oven is one," that meant things were getting crowded, and they needed a second baking stone. Despite the covert camaraderie, this was not merely mischief. These midnight bakers offered more than carbs. They offered communion of a different kind, a quiet kindness, a hot, crusty reminder that even in a cloister bound by vows, human joy would find its way, fermented, kneaded, and baked until golden. Bread has long been tied to faith, the body of Christ, the sustaining staff, the humble meal of monks and saints alike. Perhaps that's why it felt so sacred to break rules gently, like dough under tired fingers. Curiously, the abbess never addressed the matter, not even when she happened to be sipping strong, illicit tea beside a slice of cinnamon-streaked brioche clearly made from black market sugar. Some whispered she had once been a founding member of the society herself, though such heretical thoughts were best kept quiet, like a sourdough starter slumbering in a back corner of the pantry. Even the convent cat, a feline of unknown years and unrepentant smugness, seemed in on the charade. He could often be found licking flour off his whiskers come sunrise, sitting beside the oven with the look of a creature who had just confirmed that God was indeed in the carbs. And so, beneath the austere rhythms of convent life, beneath Gregorian chants and the endless folding of laundry, the bread told another tale. A tale of resilience, of gentle defiance, of little joys snuck in beside liturgy and laundry. A tale whispered in rising dough and conspiratorial glances. Tonight, perhaps, as the moon dips once more behind the chapel roof and the wind hums through the rose-laced garden, a faint thump will echo from below, the dull, satisfying pat of a perfect bull turned out onto the counter. And perhaps tomorrow, just as the sun stretches lazy arms over the distant hills, a curious slice will appear on a breakfast plate, mysteriously warm, endearingly uneven, utterly unexplainable. And with that final bite of golden-crusted mystery, we drift downward toward quieter corridors still, where whispers turn into lullabies and ink-dark secrets wait beside oil lamps and worn paper pens. Because next, we turn to something even quieter. Confession Day. Oh yes, it was a whole thing. Chapter 23 of Herb Law and Holy Remedies. In the hushed cloisters of an 18th-century convent, behind high stone walls muffled by ivy and years, one might be tempted to think time had pressed pause. But within those quiet walls, beneath the wooden rafters and the gentle drip of dew from cloistered arches, there thrived a secret realm of practical magic, the convent apothecary, run not by potions-wielding wizards, but by steady-handed nuns in aprons dusted with lavender and thyme. This medicinal haven was as real as the coughs it cured and the blisters it soothed. Herbal medicine, you see, was not only tolerated by the church, it was downright encouraged, so long as it leaned toward the sanctified rather than the suspiciously pagan. Nuns were effectively the neighborhood pharmacists with rosaries. Imagine Sister Beatrix, grey-haired but sharp-eyed, gliding softly through the garden at dawn, her sandals making the faintest shuffle against the dewy flagstones. She's collecting chamomile blossoms, murmuring prayers, or perhaps recipes beneath her breath. Chamomile for nerves, lavender for sleep, willow bark for pain, and comfrey. Don't even get her started. A bone knitter from heaven. Literally. These medicinal gardens were not whimsical little herb patches, but orderly plots carved with the discipline of a prayer schedule. Calendula bloomed in neat squares, mint in a row near the convent wall where the sun hit hardest. And angelica, yes, that righteous weed, grew in the corner known lovingly as St. Anne's elbow, named after a nun who once mistook it for celery and survived, miraculously, with nothing more than a mild stomach hymn. Inside the apothecary room, the air hung fragrant and heavy, like a page from a perfumed psalter. Glass vials lined the shelves, some labelled in neat Latin script, others bearing only the confident scrawls of nuns who'd long abandoned modesty when it came to labelling their own lemon balm tinctures. There were dried bundles tied with ribbon, some blue with Marian devotion, others plain and practical, hanging in shadowy rows from the beams above. Convent apothecaries were equal parts wisdom and whimsy. Did a lingering cough attack the abbess? Out came the honey-warmed vinegar laced with cloves and gentle scolding. Was a novice struck wide-eyed with melancholy? A blend of lemon verbena and whispered bedtime psalms usually did the trick. And for more sensitive afflictions, namely the ones unfit for polite company, there was always the root. It had an official name somewhere in medieval Latin, but among the nuns it was simply the root, spoken with a look of both awe and mild horror. Of course, medicinal knowledge in convents wasn't just guesswork with sprigs. Many of these nuns were highly literate and well-read. Their herbal compendiums, often passed down through the centuries, contained astonishingly precise instructions. Some were based on Hildegard of Bingen's writings, an extraordinary 12th century nun whose remedies included fennel for digestion, hyssop for lungs, and singing for the soul. It bears pointing out that many of Hildegard's wellness tips could still pass muster on a modern wellness blog, minus the leeches perhaps. Despite their talent, the nuns never charged for their healing, at least not in the earthly sense. Donations of eggs, linens, and candles were acceptable, and of course, your eternal gratitude was expected, ideally expressed in Latin. The apothecary served not only the nuns, but also the surrounding villagers, who would shuffle in respectfully to present their ailments like offerings on a mildly creaky altar. As daylight waned, the convent's healing sanctum took on an even softer glow. Candles flickered in their sconces, spilling warm light over mortars still sticky with honey and beeswax. A tea kettle, older than France, let out a half-hearted sigh of steam in the background, while Sister Hildegard scribbled notes into a leather-bound ledger thick with medicinal experiments and minor spills of lemon oil. This was the quieter side of convent life, gentle, healing, 1,000 years of botanical knowledge stored in calloused hands and hushed voices, where prayers and poultices mingled, and each jar contained not only herbs but hope. And now, as the convent garden settles under stars and mint-scented shadows stretch across the bench where Sister Beatrix once dozed after oversteeping her chamomile, let us draw the curtain just so. There is one final room left to peek into, where parchment crinkles and secrets sleep between the lines. Chapter 24, The Final Bell and the Velvet of Dusk. As the convent's final bell tolls across the cloistered courtyard, its sound not ringing but sighing, time seems to exhale. The day folds itself like an old linen cloth, soft at the corners and warmed by handling. Evening has arrived, not like a guest knocking loud at the door, but like a beloved aunt who just quietly appears with a warm shawl and a piece of gossip no one asked for. In the 18th century convent, the end of day was not a rude shut of activity, but a gentle swerve into stillness. The work, the weaving of lace, the tending of herbs, the writing of letters that would never leave the convent walls, was done. Needles laid to rest, books closed with a reverent hush, like the final page of a tiring but contented chapter. Now, the nuns moved like drifting clouds in their black and white habits, soft shapes barely disturbing the dusk. Their shoes made little noise on the cool stone floors. After all, no one stomps around in divine silence, especially not Sister Clara, who was once reprimanded for her suspiciously enthusiastic stomping during Lent. Supper had been served an hour ago. Thin soup with vegetables that had tried their best. Perhaps a berry or two, if Sister Marguerite had succeeded in distracting the kitchen cat long enough. It wasn't a feast by earthly standards, but here in the quiet cove of convent life, contentment was homemade and saltless. Afterwards came compline, the final prayer service of the day. Think of it as spiritual pajama time. A few psalms, a hymn that inevitably drifted slightly off key by the second verse, and the gentle creak of ancient pews resisting centuries of devotion. The candlelight flickered against the chapel walls, casting buttery shadows that danced slow, careful waltzes with the wooden saints. Even the carved Virgin seemed to exhale in relief. One more day navigated, sin mostly avoided, gossip minimized via divine effort. The life of a nun was not without drama, of course, especially after dark. Quilts of whispered stories stitched themselves across the dormitory. Not scandal, heaven forbid, just carefully curated curiosity. Did you hear the bishop fainted in the middle of Mass last Sunday? Could Sister Ursula's goose possibly lay blue eggs? And who, truly who, is stealing the nutmeg? But for all the evenings sprinkled with speculation and the occasional illicit almond, there was a deeper rhythm humming beneath it all. A slow, patient purpose. You see, unlike the wild spin of the outside world, where corsets pinched and powder wigs tickled and revolution brewed noisily in salons, the convent moved like a clock inside a shell. Lady time here wore soft shoes and always knocked before entering. By nightfall, most sisters retired to their cells, plain rooms named boldly, as though monastic simplicity was something to boast about in marble. A wooden bed, a crucifix, maybe a Latin book no one had actually finished. And yet, there was peace in that austerity. No blemish creams, no courtly intrigue, no agonizing over whether the Duke actually liked your sonnet. Just cool air and the comforting presence of God. And maybe the occasional mouse looking for forgotten crumbs. Sister Agnes, who never remembered to snuff her candle before falling asleep, would be gently reminded by Sister Helene, who very much did and had opinions about fire safety. Each sister would lie down in silence, eyes tracing ceiling beams carved before they were born, listening to the single aching word of the night, hush, and then, the moment just before sleep, when even the stones seemed to sigh, there arose, from the deepest cradle of the convent, a lullaby not sung but lived, the warm familiarity of routines, the security of sameness, the quiet triumph of women who had chosen a world with fewer choices and made it into something shaped and rich. Thread by thread, they embroidered lives of contemplation on the thick canvas of history. No kings here, no revolutions, just careful lives, lovingly lived under starless skies. So as we close this final chapter, dear listener, let the convent's hush rock you gently toward your dreams. The bells won't ring again until morning, and even then, they'll ring soft. There'll be work again, lace to mend, chickens to shush, prayers to mumble through sleep. But for now, the halls are stilled, the candles low, and time has curled up and gone to bed. And so should you. Good night.